Ladies, gentlemen, and monsters of all ages, we talk about a lot of things on this channel, but the one that we are probably the most passionate about as a whole is Monster Hunter. We know a lot of you out there feel the same way as us as well. Monster Hunter games themselves are a bit few and far between on releases, and we are currently in the exact dead zone where it has been a quite long time since Sunbreak came out, but Monster Hunter Wilds isn't quite here yet, and so as fans of Monster Hunter, you might feel a little bit of a hankering for that sort of huntin' feeling, the experience and atmosphere of a Monster Hunter game. Of course, you can always go back and play one that is already released, or you can even just sort of buckle down and wait for Wilds to happen in 2025, as that is happening, obviously. But maybe you want to know if there's anything else either out right now or coming out relatively soon that just might scratch that itch for you for a short time. So today we're talking about 5 games for Monster Hunter fans that either have released in 2024 already, will release in the remainder of 2024, or some just happen in 2025, in case you want to keep your eyes out a bit further on the horizon for a little bit further away releases. Something to keep you a bit excited long term, let's say. And we'll talk about them essentially in order of release so you know the sort of schedule of it all. First up, let's talk about one that was already released and a number of months ago, closer to the start of the year, which is Dragon's Dogma 2. This is one of the more comparable games to Monster Hunter in the way that its raw combat works and the way that a lot of its systems function. There are a large number of vocations in the game which essentially function as classes, and each one of these is the way that it is because it is centered around a specific weapon type that has its own moveset and playstyle unique from the others. This in itself should feel pretty familiar to Monster Hunter players, but then the way that combat works as a whole, targeting specific body parts on different monsters much larger than yourself for the most part, the movement being a little bit clunky but in a sort of immersive and charming way that you get used to and you adapt to, rather than just feeling like non-functionally clunky. And of course, I do have to mention this game was also created by Capcom, and there are a lot of similar ideals at play here. The combat itself feels relatively familiar, and I would argue that's one of the core things to that sort of Monster Hunter feeling, though it is surrounded by a massive open world, a ton of exploration, a decent main story campaign, and some fun side quests alongside it too. I do think it is probably the most likely game on this list that you may have already played if you are watching things on this channel. We talked about this game a lot on launch, but in case you have been sort of out of the loop for whatever reason, this is a near dead ringer for a game with overlapping audience appreciation with the Monster Hunter series. The game also recently got a pretty sizable update, including a new casual difficulty option for anyone who wants the experience of the game without having to worry about things like Dragon's Plague, which, if you don't know the game, probably sounds extremely ominous as a mechanic, and it is. It really is, without spoiling it, so you should be scared of it. Moving on then, second up we have a game that released just last month in August, Black Myth Wukong. I'm not going to presume that you aren't aware of this game because it has been wildly successful, and enough so that I imagine most people who enjoy video games, especially specifically more melee-oriented action games in an RPG-type environment, have at the very least heard of this name. However, a lot of this has been somewhat soiled by tons of different aspects. Some false claims made before the game released as well forced a lot of people to just not even want to give it the time of day. But as someone closing in on 100 hours within this game over the last month since release as a single-player game, it's definitely worth having at least a look at to see if it's something that you might be interested in. The combat itself is fluid as hell in a way that just watching the gameplay doesn't really represent. It feels really good in your hands, every button press feels correct, it feels really just genuinely smooth to play. Generally speaking, each chapter of the game's story is a large, sprawling level in itself. Some of them are more linear and clear where you're supposed to go, some have a bit more exploration in them and a bit more optional stuff around, but all of them are chock full to the brim with bosses. There are random smaller enemies, but the vast majority of your time spent in this game will be spent fighting bosses. And while a lot of them are just powerful, humanoid, regular-sized dudes, they all have their own movesets, they're all generally unique from each other in one way or another, and there also are some massive crazy abominations just to give you some sort of sense of scale and to remind you of the sort of spectacle fight feeling. There are dragons in this game that you can fight, and the satisfaction of pulling off a perfect series of attacks or putting together a build that just obliterates things that are normally found to be very hard. That in itself is very reminiscent of Monster Hunter to me as well. The story of the game itself is lovely and is exceedingly tied to Journey to the West, which is just a classic, and to me the important part is that every boss is just unbelievably imaginative. It doesn't quite balance it out with the realism part that Monster Hunter also tries to hit with this, but you can go from a boss who is essentially just an octopus man, to a boss who is just a super powerful monk, to a boss who has 2 floating heads, one of them shoots fire but can't move by itself, and the other controls wind to fling itself around and fly basically, as well as just launching the other head around the arena. And the trick to the fight is launching the head that can't control itself as a weapon to hit the flying head midair. You heard all that correctly. That's absolutely right. It's fun, it's flashy, and it does not waste your time in any way. It is just so rapidly paced in a good way. It is just back-to-back action. The bosses are frequent, and there is meaningful exploration as well in between that does reward you with items or power or optional bosses around every corner of the game that you take off of the main linear path. Third up today, we are about to be moving to unreleased games, so my thoughts will be a bit less personal and more just anticipation and intrigue from afar, starting with Ravenswatch, which actually just released last week. And I just personally haven't had the time to dive into it yet, despite it being on my radar. This is the smallest game on this list as far as the studio behind it and the actual hype train beside it as well. It has had an early access period that actually just ended quite recently before this video went up. And with this, will be coming out for the first time on consoles of all kind, and I'm personally looking forward to playing this on my Switch, which it is one of the inclusions of platforms that it's on. This can be played solo or up to 4-player co-op, and it is an action roguelike game from an angled top-down perspective. There are a number of different classes essentially within this, specific characters with their own special way of playing, then their own unique moveset based around just sort of a figure from mythology or legends of some type. The aesthetics of the game are absolutely gorgeous, and honestly, it's pretty reminiscent of the next game we'll be talking about as well, but it's definitely something quite special that I've been keeping an eye on for a bit now. The combat looks fun and intense, just well paced, as well as having a challenge to it worth putting time and effort into overcoming, the way that roguelikes tend to be. The game isn't the most obvious comparison to Monster Hunter at a glance, sure, but I think two big things that a lot of Monster Hunter fans enjoy with the series is the pace and depth of the combat against foes larger than yourself in a way that makes it very learnable, but also feel very impressive when you do get it right. Things with learnable patterns and the world building as well around this. The aesthetic quality of it all and the way that it holds together to a theme just unabashedly, even if suspension of disbelief is required at least a little bit. In this game, it's both of those things quite hard from what I've seen of it so far. And it's worth mentioning as well that everything I've heard from people who have played the early access is positive. It is a solid game, worth your time if it looks like something that is interesting to you. It has a relatively low price tag for it as well compared to most games these days, and also they have Wukong as a playable character, just to tie this back to the last entry as well. Then as we move on to our final two, neither of these even has a set release date as of yet technically, though both are expected to be released in 2025 in general. The first one I feel like I should talk about just for relevance sake, honestly, which is Hades 2. The game we just talked about draws a lot of similarities with Hades 2. It is a roguelike, the aesthetic style is very similar, the pacing of the game looks similar at a glance too, and while it has more playstyles in general and will be releasing first, and it obviously has its entire own game worth playing, does Ravenswatch, Hades 2 is something special in my heart personally. The first game had me hopelessly addicted to it for literally months in its early access period. I was singing its praises as loudly as I could, trying to get as many people to play it because I felt it deserved it. I fell in love with the game. And when Hades 2 came to early access not long after being announced, I fully fell into it once again, but only for about 3 weeks before I had to stop myself from playing and getting too involved with it because the game simply was not finished yet, and it still isn't at this point. It is still in early access. That to say, I have played this game in general. I've not finished it because you can't, and it's far from its finished state that the game will release in. It is unbelievably fun. It is a roguelike. It has a similar visual style to the last game on the list, but where the last game was about like taking heroes from various stories or myths and cultures and turning them into the various playable characters, this one focuses much deeper. It's much more story driven, and it also uses myth, but it is entirely around Greek mythology and adapting characters from this into a more modern story in a pretty fun way. As the main character, you have access to genuinely just a number of different weapons, each with their own entire moveset and playstyle. Each weapon has a number of variations within itself too that can change how you use it. Whether you want 2 small blades or a giant axe, this game has various archetypes in between that as well that you may have come to expect, and some pretty inventive secondary things, like a launching, arcing skull that explodes. The combat once you're actually in your run within this is actually just extremely fast paced, yet also very technical. Positioning is everything in this game. Dodge timing is key, and where it differs from Monster Hunter is in between each chamber that you complete within a run, you get to choose a boon from an Olympian which powers up one of your abilities or yourself, and you get to choose from a few options that are given to you at random. And these just sort of have crazy synergies available that you can get between them that you can build with each other. Almost like the equivalent of making a build in Monster Hunter, but very, very temporary, because it only lasts for the one run, lasting only for a short time, but also having a lot of RNG involved. But the power ceiling of a perfect set of boons in Hades 2 is is just absolutely off the chart, and the power fantasy when you reach it is insane, and I cannot express how immersive and enjoyable the game is in general, how lovely the story is, the music is absolutely incredible, and again, I've not even played the full finished game. Then finally, we have the First Berserker Khazan. Generally speaking, most people are tagging this one as a Souls-like, which I would argue is pretty adjacent to a Monster Hunter game, where Souls games have more of a focus on the world and exploration, the bosses fit into that and then are molded around it. Monster Hunter is more focused on the monsters themselves, which are the boss equivalent, and making cool monsters and then building the world around them that suits the monster's needs, ecologically speaking. Souls is about the world, and it happens to have awesome bosses because they're good at making bosses. Monster Hunter is about the bosses, and it happens to have an awesome world because it just relates to making the monsters feel better. That is the main distinction between these two series in my mind, but to me that also means there is a large overlap between the player bases. This game, then, from all footage and trailers released, just looks satisfying as all hell to play. It seems to have a Sekiro-style parry where you are expected to press a button at the right timing with incoming attacks to deflect them and break your enemy's stance. With some attacks you do need to fully dodge, you can't just parry everything. The actual enemy designs are incredibly inspired and interesting from what we've seen so far, and while it has a sort of Viking style to it, it also mixes that with a very clear anime inspiration, which in my experience tends to lead to some really cool results as a combination of influences. The majority of the combat looks stylish and flashy in the game, while also being actually based around player skill and timing. It is dark and gritty, but in a sort of fun way. It's very gory, there's tons of blood, but not in a way that makes it feel overwhelmingly like you're just in a helpless universe. It just sort of adds to the color of the world, and the world itself does look incredibly intriguing to me. Not to mention the sheer amount of just different types of dragon enemies that we see in the trailers as well, and the music also seems to go quite hard. All in all, this is the one that we know the least about as of this moment, and yet it is one that I'm absolutely keeping an eye on myself, and I think it's worth at least looking into for Monster Hunter fans in general. That just about does it for today then, everyone. 5 games from 2024 and 2025 that I think should be of heavy interest for any fans of the Monster Hunter series for one reason or another. They're all special and unique in their own right, of course, but generally the through line between them is just excellently crafted and satisfying combat with multiple playstyle or moveset options to choose between, and aesthetically pleasing and interesting worlds around them, of course. I hope you all enjoyed this, and of course feel free to mention any other games you think fit this bill coming out soon that you'd like to recommend too in the comments down below. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.